Welcome to Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairy Tales. I'm your host, Dr. Alan Christensen. Look, you know that between the latest online fads and the crazy media headlines, it's easier than ever to get confused about your health. And you and I just want to feel better and live longer. We want to know what works. And we can't wait for further studies. We need to make decisions today based on the best evidence we've got. Well, that's exactly what this show is here for. So let's get to it. Hey, Dr. C here with you. I wanted to do a couple of segments that went deep on soy and thyroid disease. You know, for a lot of years, my stance was just that. At first, I thought there was really no concerns. And then I heard so many of my expert friends saying there were big concerns that, I found myself just going along with it and saying, well, if we're not sure, you might as well avoid it. And that seemed reasonable. But then I had other expert friends reach out to me and show me some evidence suggesting that there could be some big benefits to soy and perhaps opportunities lost by avoiding it unnecessarily. And I came back to them and said, well, what about those with thyroid disease? Is this different for them? And they didn't really have good answers. So I really took it upon myself to go deep and find all the data that I could and get some conclusions. And I've written about those in the past. I wanted to share this topic, though, and kind of walk into the controversy a little bit, and also have people from both sides with strong views talk through their perspectives. And my goal is just to weigh out the evidence afterward and talk through that with you one time after it. So 3 pieces total, 1 pro-soy, 1 anti-soy, and 1 of me just weighing all the evidence on both sides. So this is our anti-soy, although at the end she talked about versions that she liked. So she certainly had some nuances and wasn't just reactionary. Real bright lady. Kaayla Daniel, PhD. Had a great time talking with her. She's written the whole soy story, The Dark Side of America's Favorite Health Food, and she's been all over in the media. You know, Dr. Oz, PBS, NPR, lots of places, spoken quite a bit, PaleoFX, Ancestral Health. So very articulate, very knowledgeable, and lots of perspectives on soy. So we went deep in her data and where she arrived at her conclusions, what those conclusions were, and had just a joy of a time talking with Kaayla. So hope you find this as pleasurable as I did, and let's go into the interview now. Hey, Dr. C here with you, and super happy to be joined by Dr. Kaayla Daniels. Hey, Kaayla, thanks for coming on.
Thank you. It's an honor.
So this is really cool, and you've written about this topic. You've written the whole soy story, The Dark Side of America's Favorite Health Food. So I want to go deep into that. And I don't know if this was something that affected you in a different way, but was there a time, I don't know, for me, a lot of things that I've put a lot of energy into are things in which I felt like that I saw wrong before, or I was duped about in the past. Did you have a different view on soy at one point, or how did that all play out?
Well, luckily, I never fell for the whole soy story about it healing everything from cancer to ingrown toenails. I never fell for that. Never was caught swigging soy milk and eating soy bars and soy shakes. But I did believe at one point what we were hearing about soy being a miracle food. And we were reading that in magazines, and this was even before the era of bloggers. But everybody was talking about how soy was an inexpensive food that could solve the problems with world hunger, solve the problems with disease. And we all wanted to believe that. And yet when I started to research it, it was not making sense. I was not seeing that to be the case, say, in Chinese medicine, where they did not have this idea that soy it was a good food to eat in quantity, surprisingly enough, and discovered that people were wary of it in Ayurvedic medicine, and right down the line. So I started to research it. And the original plan was I thought I could write a book about this in, say, a few months, get a nice book out. And years later, I was still working on it. Your story, right?
No, that happens.
And discovered that we have research studies going back 100 years, and particularly in the area of thyroid research. So there was a lot to work with, and particularly old studies. And people have a way of thinking old studies are not valid because they're, too old. But the fact is that years ago, there were many more honest researchers who were not beholden to the pharmaceutical industry or big food or any of these other industries, and their work truly was independent.
I'd love to get into a bunch of those. Before then, I've had a bit of training in Chinese and Ayurvedic medicine, but I must have missed out on just it's the specific references that they had to soy. So yeah, I'd love to hear what your findings were in those regards.
Well, it was really interesting. With Chinese medicine, they considered things like soy sprouts, for example, to be only appropriate for pharmaceutical use. And in Ayurvedic medicine, they talk about soy being hard to digest and most suitable for people of the Pitta, fiery constitution. So there's a few basics there. But I think it's getting into also one of the major misconceptions about soy is that people in Asia are eating a lot of soy every day. And in fact, soy is consumed as a condiment in the diet and not as a staple food. So traditionally, we're talking about small amounts of soy foods like miso soup, natto, tempeh, maybe a little tofu once in a while, but we're talking small quantities. And also the consumption patterns vary from country to country because Asia is a large country, large continent with many different dietary customs and lifestyles. But the one thing we do see is that wherever we go, they're eating the most soy in the monasteries because it seems the monks noticed that when the tofu consumption went up, the naughty behavior went down. So
now wait, so you're the naughty nutritionist. So what's up?
So the soy is good if you have a vow to be celibate.
Got it.
So people always want to know who's soy good for, and I always say, well, politicians with the zipper problem.
That's funny. I've not heard it expressed like that before, but that's pretty intuitive what that means. So you came across quite a bit of data. So I want to go really deep into some of the thyroid information. Any general things you'd like to go into first as far as just general things you found about soy and human health? There's a lot of talk about possible benefits towards cardiovascular disease, breast cancer, things along those lines. So any general topics you'd like to address before we get into thyroid? Or?
Well, the sad news is that we have more than 70 years of studies linking soy to malnutrition, digestive distress, thyroid problems, autoimmune problems, allergies. Of course, soy is one of the top 7 allergies. Some people think it will soon be top 4. It can even cause some cancers and heart disease, and those are things we're all hearing. It's perfect for prevention, but that's not the case at all.
So causing some cancers. Can you go deeper in that for us, please?
Sure. We often hear that in Asia, they have lower levels of cancer, lower cancer rates because people eat a lot of soy. Well, first of all, they don't eat a lot of soy. But beyond that, they have lower rates of some types of cancer, such as breast cancer, but they have higher rates of thyroid cancer, liver cancer, stomach cancer, pancreatic cancer. So if you're going to credit soy for preventing certain kinds of cancers, well, we need to be blaming it for the others. And the way I would put it is it's not that simple. Soy is one of many factors. There's many different lifestyles and very different diets throughout the Asian continent.
And when we're finished, and we'll talk more offline, I'll love some particular references you can forward along. Are there any you've got top of mind, or ones you've read recently, or about?
Well, let's see. The book, of course, came out in 2005, so there's 45 pages of references in the book.
Cool.
But of course, there have been some studies since then. So we've certainly got a lot of research on that. And I think it's fairly easy to look at some of the cancer statistics where they can indicate which cancers are higher, say in Asia, which ones not. For example, there's the decreased rates of breast and prostate cancer, but higher rates of esophageal cancer, thyroid, pancreas, liver cancer, stomach cancer. So it's all very sobering.
Sure. Any other general concerns? So you mentioned cancer risks, but non-thyroid, other general health concerns you've seen show up as patterns related to soy intake?
Yes, many women think soy can prevent menopausal symptoms such as hot flashes. And while that certainly seems to be true for some women, and that's actually very inconsistent, but some women do report it. But we know that soy puts most of us at risk for thyroid problems, specifically hypothyroidism, and women in that age group are also at risk for that. So I think we need to hesitate about using it to try to medicate symptoms such as hot flashes when it puts the thyroid in such danger.
Okay. So menopausal symptoms, any input on just cardiovascular health relative to soy?
Yes. Well, recently the FDA has decided that they're going to withdraw the soy prevents heart disease health claim. And I've been very involved with trying to get that to happen since 1999, when they very stupidly, in my opinion, allowed that to stand. Because by law, an FDA health claim is only allowed if there's a consensus. And with soy and heart disease, there's no consensus. There's inconsistent evidence, contradictory evidence, no consensus among the scientists. And sometimes soy will lower cholesterol, sometimes it raises it, sometimes it has no effect. And most of us are also aware at this point that cholesterol is actually a very poor marker for heart disease risk. So some of the better markers would include C-reactive protein and homocysteine, and there's evidence that soy can increase those levels. And there's also some links to heart arrhythmias and congestive heart failure.
So that claim is being withdrawn, you're saying. How soon is that supposed to show up?
I believe it's supposed to show up in a year or so, but it's in motion.
Okay. And you were part of that process? There were some boards or groups that were reviewing the claim, or how did that work out?
I was involved with some petitions that were submitted to the FDA asking for retraction of the health claim, and also some additional petitions having to do with an attempt that the soy industry made to have a soy prevents cancer heart claim. So we put a stop to that. It's just taken longer for them to retract the heart claim.
So they were attempting to also have a label saying that it could prevent some cancers.
Yes, they sure were, because after the health claim that soy prevents heart disease, soy people were allowed to put a health claim on soy milk and other soy foods saying it could prevent heart disease. And sales went from under, let's see, what was it? Under $1 million a year to like $4 billion, wow. Very quickly. And the soy industry thought, wow, well, we can take it from $4 billion to $8 billion if we have a prevents cancer claim as well.
But that one will not be able to be used?
They withdrew their petition. They okay. Just knew there wasn't the evidence, and they knew there were people like me who were going to fight them.
So let's move on to thyroid. That was the main topic. And you mentioned some data going back. I'd love just to hear your share some research, even the dated stuff, and some more current things as well. So yeah, let's talk about soy's relevant to thyroid health.
Sure. Well, soy has been known for many, many years to be a goitrogen. And of course, it's not the only goitrogenic foods. We know of many, many others, including things like cabbage and broccoli and Brussels sprouts and turnips, etc. But the thing is, soy's goitrogens do not dissipate if you're cooking, whereas some of these other goitrogens, like if you cook the broccoli, the goitrogenic factors, they lose their power. So soy not only has more of these goitrogens, but it is something that you're going to be affected by. So, and the other thing is, very few people eat other goitrogenic foods to excess. And some people eat a lot of soy. Some people are eating it for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks. So it can add up very quickly.
And the goitrogenic compounds, these are the isoflavones primarily? Are there other constituents as well?
Mainly the isoflavones, but also saponins, which is another component in there. So the isoflavones, as we know, they're plant estrogens or phytoestrogens. And they're they can interfere with thyroid peroxidase, and that's the enzyme we need to make T3 and T4. So that is the main way we have some interruption there.
And the saponins, they're acting via similar mechanisms or different mechanisms, it's thought?
I'm not really sure of that. There's been very little research, just a few studies in Japan on those.
Okay. And so some of the earliest data that you mentioned from the distant past, why don't we start with some of that data?
Okay. Well, we have early reports of enlarged thyroid glands in rats and chickens who were fed soybean rations. And we started seeing that in the 1930s. And after a while, they discovered that spiking the animal's chow with iodine could prevent goiter. And that initially seemed like a quick fix, but as it turns out, it's somewhat simplistic. So just being replete in iodine isn't sufficient. It's a factor, but it's not the only thing. So they were solving the problem somewhat, and the objective came to be to keep the animals fat. The soy would fatten them up with the hypothyroidism, so they wanted enough hypothyroidism to fatten the animals as quickly as possible, but not so much that they couldn't reproduce or they died too soon. Mm-hmm. So many of the very best studies were actually sponsored by the USDA, and a lot of really top researchers did all the initial studies on soy protein, and really, really powerful research they did.
Any early human studies you've been aware of? What are some of the earliest ones that way?
Let's see. When would the earliest be? Well, there were some when soy infant formula started to come out. And let's see. More recently, there have been some larger studies because the soy industry wanted to promote the idea that soy was not hurting the thyroid. But one of the very best studies came out in Japan, and it was published in 1991, and it involved the Ishizuki Clinic and some top Japanese researchers. And it was a small study, but all the people who were involved were tracked very carefully, plenty of measurements. And the people going into the study had no evidence of thyroid disease. And they had plenty of iodine in their diet, so iodine was not a factor there. And within 3 months, they were showing a lot of problems with hypothyroidism and in some cases autoimmune thyroiditis.
So I'm looking, I just thought I might be able to catch this one. I think I found it, but I haven't found the full article. When we're done, do you happen to have the full one you could forward by any chance?
I did. In fact, we hired a translator because the full study is only in Japanese.
Okay.
So I'll try to find that for you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just went on PubMed. They had an abstract, which sounds exactly like what you're describing. The year was correct. And there's sometimes you can find full studies off of PubMed on places like Sci-Hub, but no luck with this one. It's from Japanese from a while back, so super helpful.
Yeah, it's so wonderful when we can actually get access to the full studies, because so many studies now are sponsored by industry, and the abstract, they will write it in such a way that it pleases the sponsor, but the researchers will often have the true data and the true information, buried inside. They're trying to be honest researchers such as they can.
That's interesting. I've seen so many cases that you described where the abstract is not congruent with the more detailed information, and that's certainly a plausible reason why that could be. So, yeah. So this was in 1991. So some other human studies that you've been aware of that were relevant that way, or?
Well, I'll bring up a couple recent studies that came out, and the soy industry trots these out. And the soy industry will very loudly say that the study showed no adverse effects on thyroid function. And if you actually read the study, what they found was, and what they said was, no effect on individuals that were iodine replete. So that's a bit of a difference there, because so many people these days are iodine deficient. And the level of iodine intake has been going down down over the past few decades. It went down 50% between a survey done between 1970 and 74 and 1988 to 1994. And more recently, it's gone down even more. So iodine becomes a factor for people who like to consume soy.
Mm-hmm. So other recent studies that you've come across, or
those are the main ones. I'd have to pull them all out. There's quite a few.
Sure.
You're looking for the human ones. There were some amazing studies done by the top scientists at the National Center for Toxicological Research, but they were done, in the laboratory, and they were looking at the interference of soy and drops in thyroid hormone levels. And they found some serious issues, and they came forward, and these scientists opposed the FDA's heart health claim. But of course, people dismissed that because the research was not on humans.
Oh, okay. This was like test tube studies?
Yeah, we found some of the mechanisms. So that was interesting from a research point of view.
Okay. So any studies you've come across that were inconsistent, or studies showing that soy in humans didn't have particular effects? Or
there are studies that the soy industry says support the idea that soy is not going to harm the thyroid, but if you really look closely at them, there's some flaw. Like they were very short-term studies where initially people experienced, say, more energy. They were feeling good, with the reason being that initially soy often will stimulate the thyroid so people feel better, and then the tired thyroid that's been overly stimulated will fall into more of a long-term hypothyroid condition. So some of the studies that purport to show safety were simply just too short. Then there's the iodine issue, which comes in and confuses matters. So just many. Oh, they also, for the studies, they typically will pick people who are not at risk for thyroid disease. And the fact is many people in the U.S. population are at risk for many reasons. So they're removing the people who are most likely to be adversely affected.
Okay. So in terms of the initial stimulation, I had not heard of that before. What are the timeframes in which that's thought to occur?
It varies from person to person. But a couple of things I'd like to point out about that. The thing is that if you, say, boost the thyroid with some drug like Synthroid, or a natural one like Armour or Westhroid or Naturethroid or whatever, but then you depress it with thyroid inhibitors like soy foods or isoflavin supplements, that puts a lot of extreme stress on the thyroid. So a colleague of mine, Mike Fitzpatrick in New Zealand, who's an environmental scientist and a toxicology specialist, he points out that this is a classic way that researchers induce thyroid tumors in laboratory animals. Stimulate it and then depress it, back and forth.
So stimulate it, to be really precise. So you're saying giving exogenous thyroid hormones as an attempt to stimulate the thyroid?
Maybe that's not the best way to describe it. You might know more about that than I would in terms of the clinical use of it. But that does seem to be the effect, stimulate it versus depress it.
As a generalized effect, we would think that when someone takes thyroid hormone, regardless if they need it or not, that we would see a negative feedback by which their output would lower. The body is seeing there's more coming in, and typically TSH levels would reduce, and there's like less activity on the gland afterward. That's just why it wasn't clear.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what we are seeing in terms of warnings is that if people are taking thyroid medications, they're advised to take their soy foods separately. So we are seeing that pretty typically these days on labels, warning labels. We're seeing that on, say, websites like the MetaFast program for weight loss, that if people are taking thyroid medications, they should eat these food products, these heavily processed products that include a lot of soy, that they should
Sure.
eat it separately from when they're taking their meds.
Yeah, sure. That makes total sense. So then the iodine, in terms of there being an issue of checking iodine replete individuals versus not, uh, it's a tough thing for gauging status on that. Are you aware of methods by which they're differentiating the replete from the iodine deficient individuals? Or
It probably varies from study to study. I think the iodine issue is very tricky. Uh, there are some practitioners, as you know, who are telling people to say avoid extra iodine, and there's some people who are also extremely qualified who are recommending very high doses of iodine for therapeutic purposes. And I'm inclined to think something in between is better, that we need to make sure people are getting enough, but in the context of all their other needed minerals, because we're seeing extreme mineral deficiency in many, many people these days. And I've never felt it's just an iodine issue with thyroid health that, for example, we need to know that our magnesium status is good, that the selenium status is good, and it's never just one simple thing.
yeah, for sure. So there are some big studies. Other experiences you've had or feedback you've had about just the effects of soy for the thyroid, other things that have just cemented those concepts for you further? Or?
Since the book came out in 2005, I've gotten hundreds and hundreds of letters from people who were able to identify cause and effect in terms of their own thyroid problems. And the lucky ones found that when they cut out the soy, that gradually their thyroid function did improve and they recovered. And with some, that gets to be very challenging. So there's those many stories. And
Gets to be challenging. What do you mean?
well, it's never just a matter of stopping the soy, because often when people started consuming a lot of soy, they were already having some health problems. And so they thought soy might be a miracle food that could solve all their problems. And then their thyroid would tank, and they were having more problems than they ever might have had before, infertility problems, perhaps even heart arrhythmias or something. But what we see most often would be some of the symptoms of hypothyroidism, the weight gain, lethargy, malaise, loss of libido, thinning hair. So they would often report those. So we get them off the soy, but they've been damaged by the soy, but we're also left with whatever the problem was to start with. So it's,
Okay.
we've gone back a few steps, and then we have to look at the whole picture.
So sometimes they had some health issue that caused them to start investigating these things to begin with, and perhaps their condition was worsened by the soy, but then avoiding the soy, failed to help the original issue, and perhaps some of the ways that affected them, for some stopping it helped, but for others they seem to persist. Would that be an accurate recap?
Yes, we're all different. And besides soy being a plant estrogen, people are exposed to so many estrogens in the environment. And we can talk about, the estrogens in water, plastics, the hormones in factory farm meats. Soy's not the only devil in the environment.
Okay, so we're thinking about a big burden of a lot of other just estrogens from outside the body, and their net effect being more relevant.
Yeah, soy's a big part of the picture. I think these days a lot of people are aware of the dangers of the plastics and, of the tape at the supermarket, with your receipt. I mean, they're aware of many environmental estrogens, but there are many people who still do not understand that soy is so estrogenic.
So now I've heard some differentiate the effects of foreign xenobiotics, non-biologically derived estrogens, from those from plants, like phytoestrogens, like soy or flax or clover. And I've heard some argue that the plant estrogens act more as selective estrogen response modifiers. They're not so much hormones themselves, but they change how the body's receptors work in response to their own hormones. Any feedback about that idea? Or?
Well, the thing about these plant estrogens is the effect varies a great deal depending on what stage you are in the life cycle. So it's one thing if you're a baby, if you're a child, if you're going through puberty. There's other effects, say when you're trying to become pregnant. There's menopausal effects. There's different effects at each stage in the life cycle. And the problem is that the estrogen agonists might benefit postmenopausal women, for example, but they could contribute to cancer. So there's pros and cons, and you don't really know which way it's going to go. So, people, read that it's going to have this effect. Well, it might or it might not. And then there's things like the anti-estrogen effect that can help with estrogen-dependent cancers, but it can contribute to infertility. So, you see where this gets really tricky.
Yeah. And I guess that's the thought behind selective estrogen response modifiers. They're thought to work differently simultaneously. Like they can help perhaps alpha receptors or they inhibit beta receptors. But yeah, lots of variables to keep in mind.
Well, people have this grand hope that somehow these plant estrogens have brains and they can think in the body and that they go in and will choose to do good. But, it's more of a crapshoot.
Yeah, they certainly don't have brains.
And, I want to be clear that I do think some of these could be very useful as, say, a pharmaceutical drug where you're very carefully monitoring the dose and the duration and, as you would with any toxicology study and as you would with a drug, that they could be extremely useful. Let's just find the right people for them and monitor them carefully.
So more things to learn that way. And yeah. So any other points about soy general health, soy thyroid? I want to get some just general takeaways you would recommend for the listeners. And I want to talk a bit more about your project on detoxification. But before then, any points that we failed to get to as far as just general ways soy could affect someone's health in general, thyroid specifically?
Sure. I think people need to understand who is most at risk. And they would be people who are consuming the most soy. And one of those groups would be vegans, because many vegans are using soy milk to replace dairy milk and soy protein to replace meat in the diet. So many of them are consuming quite a bit of soy. Another high-risk group would be menopausal women who have heard it will help with hot flashes. So they're drinking a lot of soy milk and consuming a lot of soy, thinking it's healthy. And a really big group would be babies, the infants on soy infant formula. They are at extreme risk because of their small size and because they're at a very vulnerable stage in their development. So they're not getting any other food. It's just soy. So those babies are at very high risk.
They're at risk for what specifically?
Well, let me count the ways. For any kind of estrogenic problem at any stage, but often manifesting years later during puberty. So for young girls on soy infant formula, they often go through puberty much earlier. And the scariest stories we have are 18-month-old babies where they're getting pubic hair and they're starting to menstruate. And more stories, the 5-year-olds and so forth. Now, we are seeing earlier and earlier menstruation with many girls because of all these other environmental estrogens too. So, once again, soy is not the only devil in the environment, but it's one that's often not considered. And with the little boys, a lot of people don't realize that a little boy very early on is being programmed for puberty. And there's a testosterone surge equal to that of a grown man in these little boys. And that's programming the boy to go through puberty and become a man. And one of the problems we have in identifying cause and effect is these problems don't develop until years later. Mm-hmm. So in terms of thyroid, we do know that babies with congenital hypothyroidism need 18 to 25% higher doses of thyroxine if they're on soy formula. And the New Zealand Ministry of Health has advised carefully monitoring these babies. So people are aware of this kind of problem.
Well, just to back up real quick to what we call precocious puberty, the early onset of puberty. So there's some studies linking that populations that have had soy as formula, they had higher rates of early puberty.
We're seeing that. There's not as many studies as we would like, and the soy industry discounts them. Of course, I have a lot of clinical case studies that I've gotten from many doctors, many anecdotal cases, and yes, there is some research. There's both the animal studies and some human studies.
Great. Yeah, I'll love to see those too. I'll put together a list of some ones requests from you, so I appreciate that.
But there was a huge study that came out years ago, the Brian Strom study, and basically the announcement came out, big headline, soy infant formula is safe. And when you actually look at the study, they had eliminated studying anybody who had thyroid disease. They basically set it up so that the problems would not emerge.
So they took out those that had developed, or those that already had, I'm sorry, so infant formula, so infants that developed thyroid disease were excluded from the analysis?
Yes. So, you can see where there might be some problems there. And
Sure,
we figured
definitely
out that, we could see the likelihood of thyroid problems because there was a greater amount of, say, overweight, for instance, more depression, more thyroid symptoms, but they weren't counting thyroid patients.
And I'm sorry, this was on infant formula?
Yeah, this was a study. It was called the Strom study. Led by Brian Strom, and he studied the use of soy formula and its long-term effect on reproductive health. And the only adverse finding they announced was longer, more painful menstrual periods among the women who had been fed soy formula in infancy. And his conclusion was the results were reassuring, which made a few women really angry that painful menstrual periods were considered not a problem.
Yeah. They must have tracked them for quite some time to have seen things like this emerge.
Yeah, exactly. Well, a number of top scientists protested that particular study that came out. Dr. Mary Enig, the renowned fats researcher who found trans fats to be a problem back in the 1970s. Retha Newbolt of the environmental health sciences research at Triangle Park, another government agency. She came out about that, and many other people as well. So we did get the word out about that.
And I think before I pulled you back on that, you were going forward in a different direction. So you're mentioning you talked briefly about just boys and how they can also be affected by this. And
yes, we're seeing more and more feminized boys. There's a boom industry in surgery for breasts among teenage boys, young men. And again, it's not just the soy. There's so many estrogens in the environment, so it's hard to blame soy alone, but more of these boys having been on soy formula.
Okay. So you mentioned that soy was good for celibates.
Right.
So, any other takeaways, any other circumstances or types? Some talk about the idea of fermented versions being more benign. Any thoughts about some versions of it being better or worse than others or different?
Oh, wonderful question. If we're eating small amounts of soy in the form of miso soup, natto, tempeh, that's generally good unless you're allergic to soy. I think those are healthy foods. I eat them myself. That always surprises me. They think that I'm the anti-soy lady. But
I'm glad that came out. That was surprising.
But notably, who's going to eat an excess of natto? It's small.
I was going to ask if you've had natto before. Obviously, it's pretty powerful stuff.
It's powerful, and it's a healthy food, and it's interesting. People either loathe natto or it's wonderful. And there's restaurants in Japan where they have special natto rooms so that the awful smells won't, spoil the dinner of others in the restaurant. But
It's ridiculously high in some of the K2 analogs.
it's a great source of K2, and not because it's in the soybean, but because the bacteria create it.
Hmm. So when you say like you yourself, you enjoy those foods, like is there a certain frequency, a certain quantity that you feel good about, or
Well, I can't say I enjoy natto.
okay. I'm sorry, enjoy as in eat or consume. I should have been more generic.
I mean, at the moment, I've got some, and I've been eating it every day as a vitamin K source, just as an experiment. See if I start to like it better after. Tempeh, a little tofu once in a while, small quantities, say in a stir fry or in miso soup. I mean, these are healthy unless you're allergic.
And healthy in what ways? Like what are some benefits you would expect from that
Well,
versus avoiding it
they
altogether?
have some vitamins, some minerals. I'm a believer in real food and a variety of real foods. I think people start to get into trouble when they decide certain things are the miracle foods and then they're eating a lot of those. I think we mitigate the risk if we eat a mix of things.
So you got a pretty big variety of the things that you include in your diet.
I try to, yes. But the risk for people with soy tends to be those who believe it's some kind of miracle food and they're eating a lot of it. So some of the foods they're eating a lot of would be something like soy milk. And I would not say it's the absolute worst soy product out there. But the thing is, some people are drinking a glass of it for breakfast, glass of it for lunch, consuming a lot of it. And people are very surprised to learn it's not even a traditional food. It's something that the Seventh-day Adventist missionaries from America got started up in China. I
Huh.
mean, who would have thought it?
So not the worst, but one that perhaps someone could consume the highest quantities of. I've thought about that, like in the case of mercury and tuna. It's like not the highest source of it, but it's a food that someone could have all the time. So yeah, I get the analogy. So if there were one that was let's talk about the worst or the best. What would be some versions of soy you would consider the worst or the most worrisome?
I would say the most worrisome is those highly processed foods that not only have soy protein isolate and other very modern ingredients in them, but things like all sorts of additives, MSG, things like, say, the Medifast diet, some of those heavily processed foods. So, and so it's not
Well, and
the
you think about
only.
those things in the context of extreme caloric restriction too, and extreme nutrient depletion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally makes sense. And if somebody's doing that kind of diet, they're eating little packages that have a lot of soy day after day.
And it's a cheap raw material, to make. Yeah.
But it's surprising how many foods have soy protein ingredients. It's more than 60% of processed and packaged foods, about 100% of fast foods.
Hmm.
So people who are allergic to soy really have to be careful because it's lurking in everything.
What are some of the most surprising sources that like no one would expect or have soy in them?
Bumblebee canned tuna.
Oh wow! And that's like just a natural flavor or like a protein isolate or.
Well, years ago, the soy industry discovered that most people did not like the idea of soy additives because it was seen as a cheapening ingredient. So if you mix ground beef with soy, it was seen as cheap and not desirable. But after soy started becoming a health food, people were thinking, as long as I can't taste it in my tuna, I don't mind it being there because it's going to help me, right? So they've been able to sneak it into a whole lot of things. And as the technology's improved and the bitter flavors have been decreased, they've been able to hide soy much better than they could years ago.
Hmm.
But
So
for many years, the soy industry felt their biggest challenge was selling the soy product because it was seen as something that was cheap, that you would have if you were starving, if you lived in Russia or you lived in Cuba, or maybe if you were an old hippie or then a young hippie. It was not seen as something you would buy if you were a normal working person who was reasonably prosperous. So the
hmm.
genius of the soy industry was convincing people it was actually a health food that people would pay for and pay well.
So if the processed versions of soy, like perhaps like I don't know, vegetable protein isolate, texturized vegetable protein, if things along those lines might be amongst the worst, what are some of the versions you would consider some of the best?
I do enjoy my miso soup. And of course, there's not a whole lot of soy in what would be a cup or a bowl of miso soup. And most of the misos are mixed with other ingredients as well, such as soy plus barley or soy plus garbanzos, or there's just many, many different kinds of misos on the market. And often very good quality. You can find them in health food stores sold in glass jars, nice quality. So I enjoy the miso. I guess I'd say that's number one.
Okay. Where do you get your natto from? Do your health food store has that, or?
I ordered it online. So at the moment, I've got 4 bottles that came from New York, and the shipping was more than the bottles. But I thought, I owe it to myself to try the very best natto, try a couple different flavors, and see if I really like this stuff.
We'll have to get the link for that and put that in the show notes too for those who might be interested in trying some.
Okay.
It's
Well, I have to say for me, it's thumbs down, but people, they love their natto.
I've had some hand rolled sushi before where it's just basically a sheet of nori, wrapped up in a little cone and then filled with natto. And trying to describe this, help me out. Like I don't know, nutritional yeast, Parmesan cheese. It's not quite, but it's kind of in those ballparks. How would you describe it?
Well, it can be kind of cheesy and kind of stringy.
Mm-hmm.
Children can play with it. Maybe they don't want to eat it, but to swing it around the room.
It is really stretchy. It has some elastic properties to some fibers in it.
Yeah. So a lot of people would consider it interesting looking, perhaps, or totally disgusting. It's definitely a conversational piece.
You talked about the natto rooms. I hadn't heard about that before. And you said, I've heard natto in the past. You said natto. Is one of those more correct? I honestly don't know.
Well, I don't know. It's a really good question. I have to say my Japanese is kind of non-existent.
It can't be worse than my Japanese.
One of the things that I love about, there's various natto quotes that you can find, and the late Tony Bourdain, he said after eating natto, all he wanted to do was hurl himself off a mountain and hope that there was bleach or lye waiting at the bottom for him to gargle with.
That's hilarious. So I was adopted. My adoptive family's Norwegian, and so we had lutefisk, and that was a similar thing in the sense that the smell and the taste were so intense that most people loathed it, but some would claim to like it. And yeah, the house would just be so strong for days after someone would make lutefisk. You just couldn't escape the odor.
And I would say that one's a health food.
But it's a good fish,
Yeah.
The Norwegians would get large cod harvests seasonally, and they didn't have good ways to preserve it, so they would dry them and soak them in alkaline solutions. And then when it came time to eat it, you would reconstitute it. And it's have you had it before?
I had it years ago when I was traveling, and I spoke in Norway at one point. And of course, I was pretending to be very brave and willing to try everything.
It's kind of like a texture of Jello gelatin, perhaps a little thicker, but then just this super intense fishy smell. So yeah, it's powerful stuff.
Yeah.
So tell me a bit about your program you're putting together about detox, about the dirty secrets of the detox industry. This sounds really intriguing.
Well, you've probably been noticing that everybody seems to have a detoxification program out there. And lot of it's sold with a whole lot of hype, 10 days, 10 foods, and, lose all the toxins you've been building up your whole life long. And I don't feel those programs really work. And I've decided to do a program where I would share what actually will help, not a quick fix, but more long-term, in which you can safely detoxify, in which you can regain your health, and also just some of the problems with these quick fix ideas. So I'm having a little fun with it, as you might see with the dirty little secrets idea. And that's what I do as a naughty nutritionist, naughty in the sense of having some fun with things, because I think people are overwhelmed with all the contradictory and inconsistent advice. And so I have some fun with it.
That's awesome. I love just the point about the frustration with contradiction. And that's kind of my goal here, is to make sense out of these difficult topics. And, I put a lot of thought into that. And there's so many that can give really compelling arguments that seem plausible and seem logical. And there's so many cases to where the way the body works just defies intuitive logic. Like nutrients, there's so many nutrients to where a deficiency of them causes a problem, and an excess can cause the same problem. And you'd think that more would just make something work better and better, but there's many ways in which our bodies do not seem logical on first glance. So yeah, the goal is to put a lot of weight on high quality evidence. Any data we have is better than none. There was a really cool thing in the British Medical Journal called the Parachute Study. I'd encourage you to check this out if you haven't seen it before. But they talked about, it was written up as a farce, but it was about saying how we lack high quality double blind placebo controlled studies proving that parachutes work. It's never been done. we assume we assume that they work based upon anecdotal reports, but we have no blinded studies to support that. And yeah, they've even done a follow-up now in which one group of people did do a blinded parachute study, but from very low elevation. And I'd highly encourage anyone to Google this. It's hilarious stuff. So yeah, it's not always that we have to have just the gold standard of top evidence, because in many cases that just doesn't exist. But wherever evidence is there are ways by which we can rank it up and say, if there are contradictory pieces of data, which ones would be the best ones to put the most weight on.
Well, you certainly couldn't do a double-blind study with real natto.
Not without some pretty big nose clips or something.
But you're bringing up such an important point about some of the research that's out there. Some of it is so shoddy, and when you actually look at it, I mean, you could have a headline that would read something like "Soy prevents ovarian cancer." And then I'm making this one up, but then you find way down in the data that the soy was used on the male rats.
Oh, wow.
So no ovarian cancer showing up there.
Right.
Well,
this has been really good.
Yeah, sometimes talk about the Twinkies versus Snickers study. So if you wanted to make Snickers look good, what are you going to test it against? And,
Wow.
Snickers got a few nuts in it, so it might show up better than Twinkies, right?
That's hilarious. So in that context, in the comparison, it could be a health food.
And getting back to soy, what is the truth is just about all the studies where they're studying soy protein, the control is casein, and casein is a horrible protein.
That's a great point, when you have to ask what you are comparing against and see what the baseline was, what the real reference was against. So best place for people to find you, drkayladaniel.com, you said, is the best general website for you? Or
yes, that's the best one.
And that's DRKAAYLA, and then Daniel.com, and we'll get that in the show notes too. So just any last points that we didn't get to, or any takeaways you'd want to leave with people?
No, I just like to point out that besides the work I do exposing problems like the dangers of soy, I'm the co-author of one of the first bone broth books, Nourishing Broth, an Old-Fashioned Remedy for the Modern World. And that is such a healer. Like if somebody's been damaged by soy or gluten or whatever bad things they've had in their diet, that a big part of their healing, the foundation, could be bone broth. So I wrote the chapters on the history and the science of bone broth, and it's something I recommend highly.
That's great. And your books are on Amazon and bookstores, or where people find those, or your website?
Amazon for sure. The Nourishing Broth book can be found in many stores, partly because bone broth is trendy now, which is a good thing.
All right. Well, Kaayla, thank you so much for your time. This has been awesome. And I'll reach out to you and just remind some of the references you can share with me. And I'll do a synopsis at the very end, just talking about the the best data I can find, the references you mentioned, and some overall conclusions. But yeah, really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right. And everyone else, thanks so much for being here. I'll be back with you more really soon. Bye-bye. Hey, Dr. C here with you. This is just a quick recap about the points on soy and thyroid disease and general health. I'll have 3 total podcasts on this topic. This is one of the 3. Kaayla Daniels, Dr. Kaayla Daniels was the other one of the 3, and lovely woman, gave me a great interview and very passionate and very knowledgeable, learned some things from that. And I want to just talk about what I've found from medical literature, and she sent me some studies, and I want to talk about those studies and share those with you all and look at them just in their citational context. So she talked about studies, soy as a cause for cancer, and there was no citation she had on that one. There was the 1991 Japanese study, which she mentioned, and that one did show some possible effects on TSH from soy in a small group of people. It was not replicated by other larger studies, but that one did stand in isolation. There was also a fair amount of data she mentioned. There's one thing, which was a test tube study saying that soy could affect thyroid peroxidase in test tubes. Totally true. I've seen that too. And there was a lot of ideas she mentioned on soy formula in infants. And there was many letters that people had written in concern. Various toxicologists had concern about that. There were statements, really just along those lines. I'm looking at all this right now. Warnings that were made by the Israeli Health Ministry. And honestly, so the soy and infant formula and its effect upon kids apart from thyroid function is not something that I've put a lot of work into. So I did take a look at the point she made. She stated that there were no longer-term studies. I just took a moment in PubMed. There's a lot more we have to learn, and experts are in agreement upon that. There have been many long-term studies, however, and the most recent large study I could find was written last year. It was written in 2018, and this was a review of all the known medical literature entitled "Soy-Based Infant Formulas: Are Phytoestrogens Still in Doubt?" And they poured through a large number of studies in animals, in humans, and also in vivo studies. And the conclusions from that, I'll read these with you. The gist of it, they said, was that a global evaluation, and not so much just worldwide, but I mean comprehensive of all the medical literature, of the impact of soy isoflavones on human development suggests that their use is not associated with relevant abnormalities. So the negative effect of isoflavones, so the soy isolates, has been demonstrated in developing animals, and it has been shown in test tube studies, but it's not been evidenced with the same effects in humans. Now, they do conclude saying that there are things that we don't know, and there are more things we could learn, and they argue that it possibly in some cases, pronounced effects could manifest. Further studies are needed to evaluate the problem. So there are theoretical concerns. To date, many long-term human studies have not seen hormonal effects that are significant, short-term or long-term, on infants given soy formula. So I don't have strong feelings about this, but to date, the consensus amongst researchers is that we should keep looking, but there's been no evidence of harm just yet from quite a bit of data. And lots of data points. Now, thyroid in soy formula, the short version of that is the earlier iterations of soy formula, they didn't really get how soy protein bound with minerals relative to dairy protein, especially casein. You may know that you can't take iron pills and milk at the same time, for example, because casein binds with iron and a lot of it's not absorbed. But not all of it. In the case of infants on dairy formula, they have no other source of nutrients. It's possible they got no other nutrient coming into their body. So their formula has to contain everything they would need for good development. And sure, there's other factors that are wonderful from breast milk, not denying that. But as far as meeting their base nutritional needs, there's been a lot of work to make sure formulas can be, adequate. And they have iron, and more iron than they would have if there wasn't iron in the context of dairy, so that it can absorb, because there's known amounts of iron that are bound up by casein, and they've compensated for that. However, in the case of relevant minerals to thyroid function, notably iodine and selenium, the earlier days, they weren't clear on exactly how that was bound to soy protein as compared to dairy protein. And the first iterations had about the same amounts of added minerals as they would in a dairy formula. And it turned out that was not adequate. There were infants that developed higher rates of congenital thyroid disease. And the thought was that the formulas needed to be modified so that there could be greater minerals bioavailable, greater amounts available for absorption. And these reactions are not all or nothing. So binding agents don't mean nothing gets in. It means that some percent of does not. And in the early days, they weren't quite clear on what that percent was and how it differed from dairy. But once they got clear on that and then compensated the formulas, these issues went away, and there was really no longer developmental issues of thyroid disease showing up from infants given soy formula. I said congenital in my last couple sentences. That was not correct. It was not things we were born with. It was things that developed after their only source of nutrition didn't give them adequate amounts of selenium and iodine. So they found that and they compensated for that. And by and large, those issues became non-issues afterward. Now, my concern about, is there a drawback of avoiding soy for the populations that, are most typically the populations I'm talking to? Typically women, oftentimes perimenopausal, menopausal. So let's just say that soy had no benefit whatsoever. It was just not saying it was good or bad, just totally neutral. If there was a possible cause for it to harm your thyroid and it was easy to avoid, why not just avoid it? That's a reasonable enough position to take. But what really made me think differently about this was the evidence that it may not be neutral. It may be helpful. And I wanted just to talk through a few studies with you about that specifically. So there's 3 topics I'm going to mention about, actually 4, I guess, total. And that's going to be how soy can impact breast cancer in menopausal women, how it can affect perimenopausal symptoms, how it can affect cardiovascular health, and how it can affect bone density, those 4 things. I want to rush to this one because it was so surprising, but I'm going to be a big boy and be patient and, and wait on it. I always opened presents too early, and this is an example of that. So in terms of cardiovascular disease, this is the biggest killer of adult women that's somewhat controllable. Cancers and heart disease are neck and neck. Many cancers, there are definitely things that influence them, but often not to the same lifestyle degree that there is for heart disease. So this is a big variable. And what we see, this was a review of studies that were done up until 2016. And a total of 17,000 cardiovascular disease events were analyzed. So 17,000 cases of people that had severe heart disease. Of that, there was 6,200 strokes, 10,000 coronary heart disease events, and 200 others. And they looked at those that had disease compared against similar groups that did not, and they looked at soy intake and how it was relevant. And what they found was that that there was overall, okay, we got to do a quick pause. Okay, let's pick back up again. The conclusions were that there was overall evidence that consumption of soy was negatively associated with the risk of cardiovascular disease, stroke, and coronary heart disease risk. And I want to look at some actual raw numbers here. Yeah, there's about 30 studies they weighted all together, and there's a graph showing the degree to which the studies showed a decrease in risk. And boy, a couple studies did not show decreases. All the rest showed decreases. Some were much more marked than others, but it was quite a dramatic difference when you put them all together. And that's the thing, is that studies, we don't always get the same results. So you have to look at multiple studies together to get a better sense of what the overall answer would be. And I'm trying to find some relative risk numbers, but yeah, I don't want to spend too long digging on this one. But overall, a clear decrease in risk for the main types of coronary heart disease. So here's some relative risk numbers. So, oh wow, these ranged, some relative risk numbers were as low as 0.6, 0.5. So this is saying 0.51. So the risk for some types of heart disease could be as low as half as what they would be in groups that consume soy or did not. So you could cut your risk by up to half by having soy in your diet. Risk for early heart death. That's a big deal. And in this case, to avoid that benefit, you would want some strong evidence saying that the harm to your thyroid was really clear. So that's significant. So heart disease, let's put that aside for a moment. I want to come to bone density next. That one is a little bit less thought out. Well, the bone density, okay, this is in the context of overall issues facing menopausal women. And let me see if I had one more that was specific to, yeah, okay. So this was another large review of many, many studies. And their conclusion in this was that soy had pretty marked effects upon many concerns relative to menopause. That's really small font. There we go. And some of these were pretty dramatic. So this would include things like the vasomotor symptoms, fancy way of saying hot flashes. Soy will greatly decrease hot flashes. Osteoporosis and hip fracture, big changes that way. Muscular fatigue, down by about a quarter with even small amounts of soy. Cardiovascular risk, we mentioned that one in detail. Also endometrial cancer prevention risk, liver cancer prevention risk, breast cancer prevention risk. I'll come more back into that one. And then also reduction of abdominal fat, reduction of inflammatory markers, and also improved memory function, less cognitive decline. And here's the thing that really just blew me away that was in this study, but they showed that studies have proven that soy in the diet lessens the negative effect that estrogen has on thyroid function. So in perimenopause, estrogen levels are all over the place. And as estrogen fluctuates, so too does thyroid binding globulin. And that makes it to where your thyroid hormones become inactivated. And that's true whether you're making your own or whether you're taking thyroid hormones, they get bound up and inactivated. And studies have now shown that soy can lessen that huge fluctuation of estrogen in your body and therefore decrease the effects it has on thyroid function. So it can actually be helpful to stabilize your thyroid levels when you're in perimenopause. Is that bizarre or what? But there's strong evidence for that, and it makes sense. Soy is talked about as having estrogen. It's really a misnomer. It does not. It has compounds that work on estrogen receptors. And the exciting stuff, plants are really cool. We've evolved with them over long periods of time, and we interact in great ways. But the phytoestrogens, they stop estrogen from doing bad things, and they help estrogen to do good things. And that's, believe it or not, that's true. It's an oversimplification, but it's really true. So estrogen acts in some receptors that are in the breast tissue and the endometrium. And those are ones we don't want overstimulated because they create cancer, they create tissue overgrowth, they create fibrocystic breast disease. Also, the estrogen can act in receptors that are in the brain and the bones and the collagen. And those are ones we do want activated. They keep you mentally sharp, avoiding hip fracture, and having healthy skin. And what happens is the estrogens in soy and in plants, they're not like getting a shot of estrogen. They're taking an estrogen response modulator, and they plug up the receptors that you don't want stimulated, but they open up the receptors you do want stimulated. So the net effect is your body has healthy estrogen status, and this offsets the problems of estrogen dominance. Yeah, soy does not add estrogen to estrogen dominance. It actually diminishes the negative effects of estrogen dominance. So that was soy on general menopausal stuff. So now here's a quick one on breast cancer. So this has been a big point of concern, rightfully so. If there were some strong estrogenic effect, how would that translate into breast cancer? And I'd like to differentiate soy foods from soy isoflavones. So we've got these extracts from soy that are amongst the most potent portions, and they've never been parts of the human diet to significant degrees. And I would argue there's a lot of things we do not know about how they work in isolation if it's different from how they work with dietary soy. So this is not about soy isoflavone supplements. This is about dietary soy. And yeah, the group we've always been the most concerned about are those at risk for breast cancer, those who have breast cancer, or those who did have a hormonally sensitive breast cancer. And until even just a few years ago, the general idea was that if you had hormonally sensitive breast cancer, you may wish to avoid soy foods. It may have some effect on your risk that we weren't clear of, and it was reasonable to be precautious. So in a large study, they looked at how many women? Between 2002 to 2006, they gathered women between 2002 and 2006 and followed them until 2009. These are women that had hormonally sensitive breast cancer. And during this follow-up period, how many total women were there? So it was over 5,000 women who had been treated for advanced stage hormonally sensitive breast cancer. And during the time which they followed them, sadly, there were about 400 women that died and about 500 to where their cancers came back. And they looked at the soy intake. They looked at the dietary soy intake. And what they saw is that amongst women, I'll quote, amongst women with breast cancer, soy food consumption was significantly associated with decreased risk of death and recurrence. So women that had hormonally active breast cancer and ate soy had a lower risk of dying or having their cancer come back than similar women with the exact condition who avoided soy. So this is human clinical outcome studies. We now know from people and actually observing people that they did better. Not only did they not, and we can theorize, oh, sure, soy could have done this. Well, this is what happened. This is not what I'm saying I think would happen based upon some idea. This is what actually happened to a lot of women, and it was tracked closely. They had less death. They had fewer rates of cancer recurrence. This is a big deal. This is a really big deal. And this is powerful stuff. And then here's the last big study that went deep on soy and thyroid function. If you'd like to hear more about this, I did do a detailed paper on this a few years ago called The Shocking Truth About Soy and Thyroid. And in that paper, I had read all the things that were written up to date and gone through that in pretty thorough detail. And when I spoke to Kaayla going into the conversation, I was completely receptive for there being newer data that I had missed, data that I had not thought of. And I'd be telling you something very different if there was other things that she pointed out to me. She did point out to me that the soy isoflavones in formula are a concern. And I did look in the literature, and the largest studies to date have shown no harm has been identified, but it's worth still monitoring. So it's worth still monitoring, but that's less relevant to my population. And still, there's been no harm that's shown from that. So for thyroid function, in 2019, some people, this was finally published in 2019. Yep, just came out, hot off the presses. So they had gone through all the known literature on how soy affects thyroid disease. And there's data saying that, yes, it can affect animals. It can affect and interact with soy hormones in test tubes, and with thyroid hormones in test tubes. And there's certainly data saying that soy can interfere with the absorption of thyroid medication. So you don't take soy milk or tofu with your thyroid meds, nor do you take anything else with your thyroid meds, because it can make you not absorb them as well. And altogether, what they saw was that free T3 scores, free T4 scores, I'm looking at the visual analogs, they were identical with or without high soy intakes in those that have thyroid disease. And there's about, 15 large studies that make up all these data sets. So there was just no difference. Now, TSH levels, basically all the studies showed no change, barring one or two studies which showed really small change. So when you put all of it together, let me pull the conclusions up again. The conclusion was that they didn't put the numbers in this, but I read this a lot. Basically, TSH scores could change by 0.1 to 0.15 to maybe 0.2 points with a high soy intake. There was no effect upon free T3, no effect on free T4, no negative effect upon nodules or goiters, no negative effect upon thyroid cancer risk, and no change in thyroid symptoms. So what does a change of TSH of 0.1 mean? Honestly, not really nothing clinically when it occurs all by itself and there's no change in anything else or no change in symptoms, especially when, along with that, you're seeing a 50% reduction in cardiovascular death, a lower risk of breast cancer, a lower risk of abnormal changes to abdominal fat, better rates of cognitive function, and also less effect from estrogen fluctuations on your thyroid. That's a big deal. That's a huge factor for women who are taking estrogen or moving through perimenopause. Estrogen has a lot of effects upon your thyroid. So the largest meta-analysis to date said that, in conclusion, that soy supplementation, soy foods, has no effect on thyroid hormones. And any effect that it has upon that 0.1 change on TSH is of no known significance, not thought to be of any significance. So that's all we got. And again, if there was no possible benefit for this population in soy, I would say, sure, if you wish to avoid out of even the smallest plausible risk, so be it. But there's clear sign of benefit. And there's never no plausible risk. You can never prove a negative. You can never prove there's no risk. You can say silly things. Right now, you cannot prove that Elvis is not living underground on the dark side of the moon. You can't prove it. You can't say for sure it's not happening, right? And that's silly. I would bet anything it's not happening, but unless you were to excavate the entire dark side of the moon and go however deep and check every nook and cranny that someone could possibly be in, you couldn't say it for certain. And even by the time you finished, you couldn't say that maybe they weren't just on the other part of it that you weren't looking in while you were looking in that part. There's still no way around that type of proving a negative. Someone can always say, we don't know it yet, therefore it could be true. No, if you don't see something and you look hard enough, there's a point at where you quit looking. You look for a long time and you say, we haven't seen that. We have no reason to think Elvis is hiding on the dark side of the moon. Let's not put any more effort into that. We've looked at a lot of cases of this. So that's the best I've got on this. I've got another really good interview coming up on soy and thyroid function that I'm happy to share with you. But that's it. And again, I put a lot of thought into doing these, and I'm really walking a fine line. I want to thank Kaayla Daniels for really well representing the concerns that many do share. And had I had her exact data exposure that she had and her experience, I would have her same conclusions. But the benefit of evidence is that we don't have to rely on just individual conclusions. We can look at larger sets of people and see what their experience was when it was more carefully monitored. So again, thank you to her. Thank you to my other guests. And I think that this is an important point. I really want us to be, worried about the right things and not worried about the wrong things, if that makes sense. Okay, Dr. C with you, medical myths, legends, and fairy tales. I'll be back with you more real soon. Bye-bye. Hey, Dr. Christensen here. Thanks so much for joining me for another episode. Is there a topic you'd like me to cover? I'd love to hear from you. Just go to Dr. Alan Christensen on Facebook or Instagram, write your question, and use the hashtag #MedicalMyths. Did you find this show helpful? If so, please take a minute and leave us a rating on iTunes so that others can know. Thanks much. I'll be back with you real soon. Bye-bye.